Thank you. Good evening. I'm David Dower, and our illustrious guest this evening, playwright George Stevens, Jr. So, Mr. Stevens has been associated with the Kennedy Center, where I was just asking in the wings, pretty much since day one.
That is true. When the Kennedy Center opened, the chairman was a man named Roger Stevens, no relation to me. And I had just started the American Film Institute a couple of years earlier, and I was advocating that there be a film theater in the Kennedy Center, and Roger was acquiescent to that, and then he said, why don't you just put the American Film Institute in the Kennedy Center? So we had our offices right up 3 floors above where we're sitting now for many years. And then in 1978, I came to Roger with the idea for the Kennedy Center Honors, and we started that program, and I have been writing and producing it ever since. So I never quite...
Yeah, there you go.
So I never have not yet escaped this building that some people refer to as the box that the Watergate came in.
Is this your first play on Kennedy Center stage as a playwright?
This is my first play on any stage. I've been more involved in motion pictures and television and an occasional book. So this is, I am a rookie playwright.
You wouldn't know it.
Thank you.
And so can you talk a little bit about when you began this project? I know it has roots in an earlier project for you, but when did you decide that you would become a playwright with this project?
I decided at dinner one night. I was in Los Angeles, and my wife Liz and I were having dinner with Sidney Poitier and his wife Joanna. And Sidney and I had done a miniseries, which I wrote and directed, called Separate but Equal, which some of you may have seen, which is the story of Brown versus the Board of Education. And Sidney played Thurgood Marshall. Burt Lancaster played John W. Davis, the other attorney, in his last role, Burt's last role. And Sidney and I were sitting on the same side of the table, and I said, what are you up to? And in that princely way he said, I have not been on the stage in 40 years since Raisin in the Sun. I want to go back to Broadway. And as I remember it now, I paused for 10 seconds and said, well, how about I write a play about Thurgood Marshall? And he said, fine. I did. And when I'd finished it, I sent it to Sidney, and he liked it, and we started to work on it. And then one day, he asked me to come up for lunch when I was in Los Angeles, and he said, I'm 75 years old, I can't learn it. And that was, of course, very disappointing, but time went on, and Sidney was very happy when he heard that Laurence Fishburne was doing it, a younger actor who he admires greatly. And we were just very fortunate to find Laurence and that he chose to do this.
There was a moment also where you worked with James Earl Jones.
We did. That was round 2. James Earl came here to do On Golden Pond, and he and his wife are friends, and I said to his wife, Cece, I've written this play. Do you think James Earl would like to read it? And she said, yes, send it to him. And so I sent it, and he had gone back to New York. And one Friday night, the phone rang, and I didn't answer it, and Liz, my wife, answered it. And she came in and she said, it's either the Verizon man or James Earl.
Not Darth Vader. She's not a Star Trek.
Yeah. And it turned out to be James Earl who said, "You have written a kick-ass play, and I'm going to do it." And so we did it in Westport, Connecticut. And James Earl was wonderful.
I saw that production.
Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And but there were complications about him continuing to Broadway. And my son, Michael, who's a filmmaker, lives in Los Angeles, called me and he said, "Do you know that Laurence Fishburne is doing Fences at the Pasadena Playhouse?" And he said, "I think you ought to go see it." So I went out to Los Angeles and we went to see Fences, and Laurence was very good. And afterwards, we went backstage, to compliment him, and which I did, and we were about to leave, and Michael, being more aggressive on his father's behalf than his father, said to Laurence, "Did Dad tell you about his play?" And Laurence said, "What play?" And I told him what play. And I remember he said, "Well, if I ever become age appropriate, I'd be very interested," because I had mentioned that James Earl was doing it presently. And the interesting thing is that having written it for Sydney, thinking of Justice Marshall in his later life, that, the first two actors one talked to about it were the veterans, men in their 70s. And the kind of genius of the choice of Laurence is that, for those of you who have seen it, or those of you who haven't, he comes out over there as an older man, as a man about to retire from the Supreme Court. And it takes place at Howard University Law School. He's come back to talk to the students at the school where he had studied and graduated first in his class. And he comes out and he says, "Well, we might as well get right down to it." And then he begins to talk about his life. And at a certain point, when he goes back in memory, remembering his father, and there's a visual on the screen of Pullman car waiters of that era, all in their white jackets. And when he goes back in memory, Laurence is now the age that Thurgood Marshall was when he argued Brown v. the Board of Education in the Supreme Court in his late 40s. So he has the vitality and the energy to play the young Marshall as well as the old Marshall. So it turned out to be our good fortune.
How many of you have seen the play?
Wow.
Oh, a number of you.
Heavens.
Oh. And the rest of you are seeing it soon, I would imagine. Okay. So, well, we won't give it away. You kind of know what happens in this story. Good. Because when we did August Osage County, it was a little hard to talk about it with all the people who hadn't yet seen it in the room. What gave you the chutzpah, really, to decide that you were a playwright and that this was your play to write? I mean, it's clear it is when you see it. But it's such courage to say, I'm going to answer that with, I'll write about Thurgood Marshall then.
Yeah.
What gave you that kind of?
I think it's sort of the reckless abandon of youth.
Because this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
No, yes, it was 5 or 6. I was a boy. I really never thought twice about it. I mean, I write, and the challenge of writing for the theater didn't seem that much different than writing for film or for television, and in fact, the principles are all the same. And
the story principles.
Storytelling,
Yeah.
exactly. So I just did it, and I had done so much research for Separate but Equal. My friend Vernon Jordan introduced me to the key figures in the Brown case. Spotswood Robinson, Oliver Hill, Judge Constance Baker Motley in New York, William Coleman.
Wow.
And I'd interviewed all those people and learned a great deal about Thurgood. And he had done several oral histories, which were available to me. So it was, a very kind of enjoyable challenge.
You also grew up in D.C.
No, I grew up I was born in the Hollywood Hospital
Okay.
in Los Angeles, and I grew up in Los Angeles. And I didn't come to Washington except for one trip when my father was going overseas during World War II. We came to see him off at National Airport over here. In 1962, I came here to join Edward R. Murrow, who'd come to serve President Kennedy as the director of the United States Information Agency. So that was my...
So 62.
Yeah.
So that's prior to him joining the court, Marshall being...
Yes, prior to him, he was at that time a judge in New York.
New York judge, yeah.
And he retired from the Legal Defense Fund. He spent almost his entire working career at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It was the organization that those of you who saw the play would know was the Legal Defense Fund that organized the Brown organized all of the civil rights cases, including Brown.
We should stop and mention that this is the 118th anniversary today of the day that Plessy refused to move to the Black Railroad car. And so it's kind of an auspicious evening for those of you who are seeing the play this evening. The play actually kind of jumps up from there.
That's right.
The Plessy case. Can you talk a little bit about, there's so many accomplishments in Thurgood Marshall's life. You choose to start there, which is not actually his beginning, but there must be something that makes it a beginning for you.
That's interesting. Now I have to think back of why.
It's not exactly the first thing, but it's sort of where the play jumps into.
It's very,
the movement.
very, very early in the first couple of minutes.
Do you know this case? It became Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate, but it established separate but equal as the law.
Yeah, Thurgood's kind of introducing himself to the students at Howard, and he says, I was born in Baltimore, and he talks about his family. And then he mentions that the year he was born was the year that Jack Johnson became the heavyweight champion of the world, the first black prize-fighting champion, and that they started looking for the Great White Hope to defeat him the next day, and that there were race riots in Springfield, Illinois, and in that year they started the NAACP. And that leads him to talk about Homer Plessy, who on this date, how many years ago?
It's 118.
118 years ago.
A few minutes to do the math, but
it took, where they had, after the Civil War, they'd abolished segregation. And, but then gradually these Jim Crow laws came into being, and they had a law in the state that, in the South, that there would be separate Pullman cars for white Americans and for black Americans. And Homer Adolph Plessy took a seat in the whites-only car, and he was arrested. And he was taken to Judge John Ferguson and fined $50. And they called this law, calling for separate cars, it was called an act to promote the comfort of passengers. And he was fined $50. He refused to pay it, appealed it, and gradually his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think it was in 1905 that the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 against Mr. Plessy, saying that separate but equal, as long as, quote, equal facilities were provided, that separation of the races was legal. And as Thurgood says to the audience, Homer Adolph Plessy, remember that name if you want to know about my story, because where he would end up in the Supreme Court would be arguing in the Brown case that Plessy v. Ferguson was unconstitutional.
And so, to me, I guess I asked the question, it was sort of a trick question. You started your life with this project, actually starts in a project called Separate But Equal, which is about Marshall arguing that case.
Yeah.
And that whole time is preceded or sparked by the fact that there was this earlier case, which is today. The anniversary is today. Yeah. So you were here through much of the history that you're writing about, certainly in the last third of the play. To what extent is your Washington life, has that informed this play, or is it really the research into Thurgood's, Marshall's life?
Yeah, I've chosen to live in Washington, though I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles and considerable time in New York, where the show business whirls, although Washington is becoming more like show business than Hollywood. Everybody worrying about whether President Obama is acting enough and showing enough empathy and pain, rather than doing his job. But that's cable.
We can go there, George.
Cable television is another topic. We can do that tomorrow night. But I've liked living in Washington, working in the Kennedy administration with Ed Murrow. I headed the motion picture division of USIA and made documentary films. Made a film called 9 from Little Rock, which won the Academy Award. A documentary was the story of the 9 students who went into Little Rock High School. So, and a film on the March on Washington in 1963. So I think I was predisposed to this kind of information, this kind of quest. And living in Washington has very much shaped what I've done, in the creative area. I made a miniseries, another one that also won the Emmy for the best miniseries, called The Murder of Mary Phagan, which was about another famous law case about Leo Frank, who was a Jewish factory owner who was charged with murder in Georgia around the turn of the century. So I'm interested in history, and I think this, stimulates my creative side.
Is the Frank story also the musical Parade?
It is.
Okay, good. I'm going to have it right. So if you know that musical, it's not particularly the sunniest of musicals. It's a beautiful musical, but it's a tough one. And a lot of what you've done, it seems, so you moved through this time, certainly the civil rights movement, the years we come to think of as the core of the civil rights movement. You moved through that a lot as a journalist, as a witness. Yeah?
Well,
and
to a degree, yeah.
And your work seems to have, you keep returning to that. It's a formative period for you.
Yes. I learned, sometimes you never know quite why you do something.
Yeah.
And I had a discovery the other night, right outside this theater. Having served in the government at what was arguably the most exciting time certainly in our century, to be in the government during the Kennedy years, where so much seemed possible and people were committed and important things were happening. I came to believe in government and that government can work and that it is a noble calling. And after the opening night last Thursday, we were outside. Justice Roberts was sitting where you were sitting, and Justice Breyer was sitting where you were sitting. Justice Ginsburg was sitting where you were sitting. And Stephen Breyer, a particularly fine Supreme Court justice, who is a friend, said something that hadn't occurred to me in his kind of agitated way of talking. He said, "I will tell you why this play is important and why everyone should see it. It is about government working." And he said, the American people need to see that. They need to remember and believe that government can work. And so it caused me to think that that was, though I hadn't thought of it until he said it, was probably a subterranean impulse in me enjoying the story of this man, a man of heroic imagination, who made government work, who earned a unanimous Supreme Court decision overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, which had been law for 60 years. So that's just sort of a little illustration that some of us don't always know what we're doing and why we're doing it.
You've been, this leads me to two questions. You've been working with this material for a longer time even than this play. But the play, when did the play begin in Connecticut? When was the James Earl Jones?
2006.
2006. And so some years prior, a couple years prior probably.
Let's give it this decade.
This decade, great. So
I think I
how has
probably
the
talked
play
to Sydney
changed?
around 2000.
As you, not that the text changes, but really when you watch it as the times change, how has the play changed for you? As you're watching the why, the what resonates, what do you see over the time? Not so much the different actors, but over the time, his life lens through this set of years.
I'm not sure I see a great deal of change. Because I think basically what happened in Westport, Connecticut with James Earl is happening here. And the audience laughs more than they expect to.
Yeah.
They applaud more than I expected them to. And so it's always moving for me to see it with an audience. Particularly pleasing to me because so many African Americans are seeking the play out and coming to it. And I've sensed, and I love it, because I saw it in Westport, I saw it in New York, and I see it here. African American women watch this play and they go, There are moments where they are right there and they're saying, we know what that's about. And it's very pleasing. And it's also pleasing to me that African American parents bring their children, and so many of them have said to me that they're so pleased that their children could see it because it's a way for them to understand what life was like for the parents and their parents. So for me, it's a play of many pleasures.
Does the fact that it's here, as opposed to Westport or New York, are there differences in your experience or the audience's experience of the play by virtue of where you are?
Yes, I think it's very exciting having it here, and the theater suits it. It frames it, and it's much it's not much, but it's larger than the Booth Theater where we played in New York, and certainly larger than Westport, but it doesn't seem too big for it. One man's able to kind of fill the stage and engage the audience. And, you know, it'd be hard for me to characterize how the audience is different, because I almost started to say, well, there are probably more lawyers, but I think every lawyer in New York was there, and the Yale Law School came down, and the Harvard Law School, and if I meet another Thurgood Marshall clerk.
So the play seems to be
I will
landing
say
no matter where
this.
it is.
This I will say, like wine in a casket. This play has been in Laurence Fishburne for 2 years.
Yes.
And he has gained such assurance and command of it. And he has so captured Thurgood Marshall and the other characters that he plays. I mean, those who saw it, you know, when he does Lyndon Johnson, you know, it's just so convincing. So you're seeing a man at the top of his game.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have a piece here that is both entertaining and beautifully constructed to instruct.
Mm-hmm.
And for many people, it's going to be the most cogent presentation of that history, of the movement from Plessy to Marshall's death, really,
Right.
that we're likely to get. It's so well distilled.
Mm-hmm.
What's your plan for how to reach more than the people who can be in the theater on any given 8 shows a week?
Well, nice that you asked that. On Saturday, the 19th, and on Sunday, the 20th, there are 4 performances. Laurence does 4 performances. And we will have cameras in the theater.
Okay.
We will film it, video, high-definition video. And the Annenberg Foundation is supporting it. And on Constitution Day, this September, they're going to put DVDs in 40,000 school systems. Yeah.
When you produce the Kennedy Center Honors, you can get some stuff done.
My son, Michael, who now produces the Kennedy Center Honors and writes it with me, will direct the televising of this. The director of the play will also be here, Leonard Folia, who has done an extraordinary job directing this play, and he has been a valuable collaborator to me. As you asked how the play has changed.
Yeah.
It hasn't changed a great deal, but you know, it begins the same way and ends the same way, and the middle's the same way. But as you have the opportunity to see, in the first instance, Sidney read it, which was very helpful to me. He's a fine actor. And then James Earl play it for 3 weeks. You learn how things are working, and as recently as, last week, I changed a couple of lines just to sharpen them. And it's, with a movie, you lock it up, and that's the way it is. With a play, you have the opportunity to hear the actor do it and make little adjustments. And Leonard Folia has been a very valuable collaborator in that respect.
Mm-hmm. I could plug that he's also Anna Devere Smith's collaborator, Living Down Easy, which will be at Arena.
Indeed. When?
Yeah, actually in December.
And how much are tickets?
That I don't know, but the number is, no. I won't do that. So you're obviously, this period you have captured so well. What's coming up next for you, and is there play in you again, or are you, again, you don't know exactly what you're doing, it's just going to come when it comes?
I think I've enjoyed this. And, you know, I'm waiting for the muse to visit me. But I would like to do another play, but I don't have one in mind. Presently, again, in collaboration with my son, I'm making a feature-length documentary about the greatest of all political cartoonists, Herb Bloch. Many of you remember in the Washington Post, won 4 Pulitzer Prizes, and was a friend of mine. And so I'm doing that, and that's something that interests me greatly. And it's really, one appreciates, as time goes by, the joy of a creative life, that there's always something out there. There's a new challenge and, you know, a story to tell. And so I really value that opportunity.
Is there something specific to you that is the experience of theater that you appreciate more than, I mean, is there something about theater that, as opposed to your work in film and television, that draws you to it when you?
Well, I think it's an extension and a variation on what I enjoy about movies. My father, George Stevens, was a very, very, very fine movie director. He made Shane and Giant and A Place in the Sun and The Diary of Anne Frank and Gunga Din and More the Merrier and Swing Time. So
that's the sort of AFI list of 100 greatest films.
Yeah.
But
So I had an exposure. I worked with him. I was in the editing room on A Place in the Sun. I worked with him on the set of Shane and was in the editing room and Giant and The Diary of Anne Frank. I was the second unit director and associate producer. So I worked with him, and always when asked what was the most important thing I learned from him, it is respect for the audience. And in those days, and to some degree today, studio executives were fond of saying, well, the audience, they have the mentality of a 14-year-old. Not to say anything against 14-year-olds, but I mean, that was their kind of, you know, they're not very smart. And Dad had this idea of respect for the audience, that everybody might not be kind of formally educated, but people have insight and people have life experience, and they go to the films, they go to the theater, and they bring that life experience, and they're capable of all kinds of comprehension and appreciation. And I remember sitting with him in the first preview of Giant with Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson and James Dean, which, you know, went on. He ended up winning the Academy Award for it. But that first night in San Diego, watching it after working on it for 3 years for the first time with an audience, and sitting next to him and almost seeing the rapture on his face when the audience was laughing, you know, or responding. So I've always enjoyed that experience with the audience, and I love to see a film of mine, you know, with an audience. And with the theater, that's compounded because each night you can walk in and see it with a different audience. So that would be.
And, you know, and the audience changes the play, changes the experience in a way that they don't with the film.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. Especially a solo show. I mean, the sense of you as the last actor cast, each of you, is very true in solo. And
Right.
so you do change it every night.
Right.
Sounds like you've done a similar thing with your son. Has he been working with you? Has he come to films by working with you? Or?
I'm afraid so.
Uh-huh.
We raised our three children in Washington to ensure that they would not go into the movie business unsuccessfully.
I'm going to turn it out. Do you mind taking questions from the
No,
audience?
I'd love to do that.
Since we love
Thank
the
you.
audience, let's go to the audience. Anyone have questions for our playwright here this evening? So the first part of it is that the play is wonderful, particularly because for people of a certain age, born probably after 1960, probably, it's a dim memory at that point, and especially anyone born more recently, this history is not present in the daily life, and a lot of people don't know these stories. So that part of that is just the great service of the play itself. And then the question, what's going to happen, is there something coming about the post-civil rights movement?
Yeah, I mean, the time after the civil rights. I mean,
Yeah.
what has happened that it's sort of starting again with Obama being 40 years later? It seems like we're having a new cycle. We have
Yeah.
the same issues.
Do you feel that you've been here, so came with the Kennedy administration, do you feel at the start of a new cycle?
On November 20th of 2005, I wrote to Barack Obama telling him
2005.
why he should run for president in 2008. So I was privileged to be part of that process. And you might be interested, because you might ask why. And the first time I met him was in 2003 when he was running for the Senate at a fundraiser at Vernon Jordan's house, my friend. And Vernon said, "Come over, you don't have to give any money, I just need people." And I walked in, I was early, and there was this young candidate standing there, and he and I talked for 10 minutes about Thurgood Marshall. He had a portrait of Thurgood Marshall in he was not yet a senator, but he would have a portrait of Thurgood in his office. And then in November of 2005, on what was Robert Kennedy's 80th birthday, he spoke at the Robert Kennedy Human Rights Awards in the Capitol, in the Senate caucus room, where both Bobby and Jack Kennedy had announced for president. And he spoke that day, and he had been, was a friend of Bobby's, and had been to so many Robert Kennedy events since 1968. And this was so different, because he spoke about Robert Kennedy not as something of the past, but he made those ideas contemporary, and he made them alive. And that's what caused me to write to him and urge him to run for president. And, I think your point is valid, and we've been kind of blessed with this play. When it was on Broadway, it was 2008, and Barack Obama was running for president, which, I'm sure kind of stimulated or created added interest in the play. And then 2 weeks before we're coming to Washington, Barack Obama announced he's appointing a Marshall law clerk, Eleanor Phagan, nominating her for the Supreme Court. So we consider that very helpful. We're appreciative.
It's all marketing. It's all marketing.
And my Dottie McCarthy, who works with me, was in New York in April of 2008 when we had our opening night. And a lot going on, and I'm busy, and she says, "You ought to call the answering machine here at your office in the Kennedy Center from New York. There's a message." Dottie usually tells me, Joe called, or Sarah called. Anyway, so I dial it, and this voice says, I know your play is opening tonight, and I certainly hope it's a great success. And I'd be there if I wasn't running for president.
Sweet. You have a question over here?
Good, two good questions. I think having some acting experience is valuable, but not essential, as I prove. And you know, your question about, you know, how you put it all together, I mean, that's really, you know, it's hard to talk about it because you don't know why you do things. I mean, I've had a lot of experience with audiences, and I have an instinct for what works. And you have a lot of this information, and you have some ideas. I had a little note in my notebook, which I saw the other day, with all my notes for writing the script, and it said, "Information is my enemy." Now, what I meant by that to myself, you're so inclined to want them to really understand Plessy, and you start, you know, giving too many facts. You know, the great director Billy Wilder, movie director, said, "Don't give me facts, give me emotion." And that's a variation on the little note to myself. And I hope if you enjoy it, I mean, the Martin Luther King passage is 5 lines or 6, and it's, you know, you trust the audience, you don't talk down to them, you assume they're going to know who Martin Luther King is. It refers to Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Civil Disobedience. Now, you know, many people in the audience may not know much about Thoreau, or the young people may or may not, but you don't explain it. You put it there and let the audience have the satisfaction of connecting the dots.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, I'm going to come here unless there's somebody I really just broke a contract with. Let's come here.
You shared your affirmation for your father, sharing his experience and sharing with you to have respect for the audience. What are some of the lessons that you're sharing with your son, who is following your footsteps within your career field and venturing into film, into Playwright? What are some of the lessons that you share with him to continue on?
Well, it's interesting. As I look back on my work with my father, I guess he spoke of respect for the audience, but he was not a man who was saying, "You guys see what I'm doing here? I'm putting the camera high." The learning came from observing and being part of it, and I think with my son Michael, it's quite the same. And he looks at a lot of films, he sees plays, and he's directed 2 movies, independent films, feature films. So, you know, for people who are interested, the best thing that can happen is to find an opportunity to be around people doing this kind of stuff. And I know they're offering internships to everyone at the arena stage. So.
Yeah. If you can't do the audience, you can come be an intern. All right, you know, there are many more questions, and there's so much more. This is such a history here that we have on the stage with us today. But we do have to stop. They're going to have to set for the show. So it sounds like we've got some information about how to volunteer for the audience. But before we do that, can we just thank our guest this evening, George Stevens, Jr.
Thank you. Oh, please. Thank you. Thank you so much.